Just a clarification, I'm not a director, I'm just an ordinary research fellow of the National Defense College. What I would like to do now is a short overview from, which I called inadına, which means against all odds in Turkish, of the Turkish left-wing extremism, which is extremely important to understand the political mentality in Turkey. It is these topics of the 1960s, 70s up to now frame the perception and the understanding of both Turkish opposition abroad and in the country, the Turkish communities in Europe, and of course the Turkish government. It is absolutely underreported, and in a way I would say the Western literature on the Turkish left is much less critical than what Turkish leftists wrote about themselves in Turkey. So you see more in intellectual sophistication on the side of left-wing intellectuals in Turkey than. Now, coming back to what we're talking about, I'd start with a short remark, namely that Turkey never developed a strong social democracy in the Western European sense, and leave it with that. What we have on the left is a sometimes very left-leaning and sometimes extremely aggressive secular Kemalism, so a national liberation ideology basically, with a lot of nationalism and all the equality thinking, and the Turkish Communist Party. The Turkish Communist Party was immediately after its inception sacrificed by Moscow following the Atatürk and Lenin agreement, and didn't play too big a role as an organization. However, as an organization in exile, it continued almost until this day, and it was an important intellectual movement. So when we have not only the biggest poets being part of the party, Nazim Hikmet was even the head of the foreign organization, and other prominent Turkish communists made it into Komintern, and most of them ended their lives in, I would say, in Eastern Germany or in Muscovy. Now, this left-wing communism has a very strong identity until now. It's very badly defined, and the question of how much Marxism is in there is hotly debated. Fact is, chunks of the modernization ideology of the Kemalists in the 1930s, especially with magazines like Yön or Kadro especially, comes from the communists. There were even ex-communists integrated into the Kemalist thinking. After World War II, with the democratization of the country, when the Democrat Party came to power, especially within the armed forces and the police forces, but especially within the army, you would have a continuation which is easily to be compared a left-leaning nationalism, as we saw it with the Ba'ath in Syria, as we saw it with several South Americans, and you had this young generation of officers who took over the mantle of Atatürk as a total independence, hence critical towards NATO, and they pushed for reforms, and many of them came from the countryside, saw the suffering of the people with the landlords in power, and insisted of the land reform. And this forced many of the communist organizations, which were strictly forbidden, and there was a strictly crackdown on them, to rethink their position, so that we had some of the ex-communists moving closer to the position of certain elements within the Turkish armed forces. And one of the results was, 1960s, the left-leaning coup d'etat. I have to cut out a little bit, but this coup d'etat and the way it was managed explains most, with the exception of the 1980 coups, all the other coups. First of all, you had one topic, get rid of the government, then extremely unfair trial and even executions, then the universities were purged, then the newspapers were purged, and then the unity of the military factions broke down immediately. So they were then excluding one each other and kicking out one each other. This is important to see because the left had two answers to it. One group formed with new independent-minded people, the Turkish Workers' Party, which made it into parliament. Another group, both ultra-Kemalist and communist, said, we formulate a new idea. This was the National Democratic Revolution. Basically, it was a lot of nationalism, Kemalism, egalitarianism, so against the bourgeoisie, always against the bourgeoisie. In those years, the word bourgeoisie also was code for Jews, Armenian, and Greek. The true people, very in the Russian Narodniki sense, you have this decadent city, urban people, but the countryside, this is where the real Turks, the egalitarian live. And the proponent of this was Mihri Veli, the leader of the Youth Communist Party who participated in the Greek war with the Greek communists and in the civil war. And Veli would formulate it, and he would formulate this thesis, and he emerged in the 68 students movement. The 68 students movements brought other ideological elements into the Turkish and now universities. First, they brought in Maoism, Guevarism, and Marighellah's, the South American Marighellah's urban terrorism concept, plus the cause of Palestine. Palestine became key. From 68 to 72, and then later on, and partially until now, you would have the expression Philistina Gitmek, let's go to Palestine, which means, of course, Syria, which means the Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and in Lebanon. Hardly any one of them saw ever combat with the Israelis, but they went there. And from the student movement, 3 organizations emerged. One was totally spontaneous under a certain Dennis Gasmish, which was called the Liberation Army, the People's Liberation Army of Turkey, or THKO. They were spontaneous. They tried everything from urban to country guerrilla, and they were a total failure. Militarily speaking, they were a failure, but one important point, they tried to attack, they had excellent relations to the Palestinians, and they tried to attack, blow up the radar station in Nurhak Mountains in Malatya. The second group was called Turkish Liberation Army and Party and Front, under a certain Mahir Chayan. He was more systematic. He had this idea of 2 pillars, a civilian pillar, political pillar, and a military pillar, and but was a prolific writer. Permanent Revolution is one of his most important works, but it was a little bit confused because they couldn't decide. Is it Maoist from the countryside to the cities, or is it from the cities to the countryside? And they changed several times their tactics, which ended in failure, but it ended in a quasi-heroic failure. First of all, they did kill the Israeli consul in Istanbul. They kidnapped him and then they killed him, Ephraim Elrom, knowing very well that Elrom, or Elrom Hofstetter, was the Israeli officer who interrogated Adolf Eichmann. This was very well known. Then, when they were detained, they fled the prison and they came to a village called Kizilderri, where they took British and Canadian officers hostage. The shootout ended, 15 people dead, and so on. Basically, end of story from the military side, but immediately the heroization started. And the third group was much more systematic. And it's also this group which until now continues in a variety of forms. This is the Turkish Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, which means Maoist, and the Turkish Farmers and Workers' Liberation Army. Now, they were all defeated until 1973 and re-emerged after 74. I will not give a rundown of all the organization. It's about 40 which spread out of them. But in the 1970s, we could see a clear trend where different armed groups could even control whole parts of the cities, especially the so-called Gecekondu, the region, the shanty towns of the big cities. And I would like to point out three of them. One, the liberation movement, which later on moved back to Palestine, moved to Palestine. They did a lot of attacks against police and military, but basically had a very mature reasoning and an intellectual thinking of what they are doing and why they are doing, and they were much more pragmatic, so that you could negotiate with these people. The most pragmatic organization was the Revolutionary Path. They were even succeeding in building up a parallel administration. So when you think of 2016, when the PKK was building up its parallel administration in southeastern Anatolia, this was nothing new for the Turks. They knew it from the 1970s. This movement cooperated after the coup d'etat for a short while with the PKK, and then was chased out of Turkey by the PKK. Literally, they had to decide whether they fight the state or the PKK, but they were totally crushed, and later on became an important, or followers of them became an important intellectual movement. Taner Akçam, the man who wrote the famous book on the genocide against the Armenians, was one of them. He was actually the leader of the organization. Parallel to them, the TKPML continued, and with them we see already two facts, a confessionalization and the ethnification. The ethnification came especially in the Kurdish area, and we can talk about this later if you're interested, and this was dominated from 1979 onwards by the PKK. Only the TKPML could continue to recruit, and then mostly Alevite Kurds. So from the defeat in the 80s and the re-emergence in the late 80s, the 1990s would be dominated by mostly the PKK and the TKPML and its splinter groups. The splinter groups then reformed in 94. I mean, there are about 50 splinter groups. Basically, every village in Tunceli has its own organization. But the most important are the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, which is a merger of several splinter groups, which is still from 2012 onwards, and then from 2015 onwards in Rojava, and the the Maoist Communist Party, and a third branch under the old name. They're mostly recruiting in the Alevite regions, and they're all relocated to basically Germany and Austria. So in Austria, they're mostly in the west of the country. Another group, the so-called DHKPC, the Revolutionary People's Liberation Front and Party, relocated to Germany also. They took for a while the name Dev Sol, Revolutionary Left. They had their shootouts both in Istanbul and in Germany in the early 1990s. So basically the Central Committee was wiping out the opposition, and the opposition, the Central Committee. They survived, and they are one of the most lethal and most fanatic and one of the strangest organizations until this day. Acting from Germany, one of their acts was to try to kill Erdogan and his state visit in 2016. Very well connected. There are great similarities to certain Greek organizations. All of them are very active, and I have to ignore a lot of other groups. And these groups had to react on two factors. First, the new emergence of the Alevi movement. The Alevis said, what we want is a recognition of the state as Alevites. We don't want to we don't want to become Sunnis, but we want to be recognized in our way as we are. Now, with organizing the Alevites, with focusing on rituality and on culture, the Marxist and these ultra-leftist organizations feared that they would lose the grip on the youth. So they started to Alevize themselves, starting with stories like then, in ultimately what the PKK did, declaring all the Kurds and Alevites being Zarathustrians, because Öcalan said so, until the fact that being an Alevi means to be a revolutionary, and you have to be in the revolutionary fight. In the 90s, when we had the re-emergence of the pogroms against the Alevi in Sivas, for instance, the Alevi community was capable of forcing these left-wing organizations to shut up and not to show their symbols. This was in 1993. In 1995, The riots in Ghazi was already the other way around. These left-wing organizations took over Alevi institutions in the city of Orhan Ghazi, and what appeared as a left-right city fight in the mid-90s was actually understood by the whole right-wing spectrum in Turkey as a confessional warfare. I have to skip something. With the PKK several times tried to organize all these left-wing groups in different frameworks in order to have a partner and in order to cover those areas in Turkey where they have no access. For instance, they always wanted to get access to the Black Sea, or they needed help for the Amanos Mountains to get to the Mediterranean. Which did not work to their satisfaction, but they tried time and again. In the end, from 2015 onwards, with the Battle of Kobane and in 2013 the Gezi Revolt, a new, more anarchist trend came up, like the social resistance, Social Isyan, and they all were then leaving for Kobane, or what they call Rojava, and were unified in the HBDH, the United Revolutionary Front of the People, and using the symbols of the Spanish Civil War and the internationalist revolutionary battalions, Freedom Battalion. As this second battalion, which is not a battalion at all, includes a whole list of international organizations alongside to the Turks. Now I have to find them. Yeah, we have Spanish groups, we have Greek groups. Greek is there are very strong relations to the Greek left from the Turkish left, and they are guided mostly by the YPG. Only the MLKP has an own status with the PKK because they're also in Iraq, where they have their own training facilities, so they are more respected as an independent partner. Now, there's a whole set of abbreviation and settings, and sometimes one group says we don't go into these frameworks, but with these two frameworks, the BDH framework was clearly on the initiative of the Command Council of the PKK. So you see Duran Kalkan and you see Cemil Bayek from the KCK leadership to tell how to interpret this and that. And the Internationalist Battalion acts a little more independently. There's a Spanish revolutionary group in it. There are French groups, and from Greece, it's the Revolutionary Union. Yeah, the Reconstrucción Comunista from Spain, the Bob Crow Brigade from the UK, the La Brigade Henri Krasutsky from France, and several others. Interesting is the Germans, obviously the Germans from the Antifa, also including American Antifa, that's very interesting, going more directly to the YPG than they go to the International Battalion. But they come back, and why would the PKK be interested in these groups? For two reasons. One, they want the hegemony of the interpretation of international solidarity. They want to keep them under control. Secondly, they are citizens from other countries and do the propaganda. It is them who connect, I don't know, Rojava with Catalan independence and so on, whatever other cause. And it is them who have the access to media, parallel the PKK media. Plus, HDBH also does a lot of attacks inside Turkey, like last week, the attack on the ammunition camp storage in Urfa, where they blew up the missiles for the 20th Tank Division. Final point. The internationalist battalions, yes, they're well trained, and they allow the PKK to the YPG to retreat to Haseke with all the equipment and so on, gear in place, and to let the women units and the internationalists and the Christians to fight in Tel Tamer, in Reis Line, and so on, and then which then gives a much bigger international publicity, whilst at the same time you keep your core and your well-trained cadres. we don't know what will happen with the YPG and the American relationship with them. It is from if you're critical to the US, it's of course priceless to see American special forces under the Red Star and the sickle and the hammer. But irony aside, it becomes a very, very serious security problem in Central Europe for the simple reason that until now, important countries in Europe, including mine, which is in my view also important, but important from the perspective of the Turkish immigrant communities. Then there's only a few countries which are important in Europe, that the governments have lost totally the interpretation of the narrative of what is ongoing in Syria. So when you lose the interpretation of the narrative, you have now a fact that PKK and left-wing talk dominates the left-wing and mostly the Western media. Even the Washington Post and the New York Times sound like Özgür Gündem, like a Stalinist paper, or, I'm ready now, or because the Turkish government gave up to influence anyone of the Western politicians or the public, but they keep firm control about the Turks, the non-left-wing Turks in Europe. So in the mosques, mosques are quite militarized in the sense of rhetorics, and in their papers and so on. So they have a very, very tight control. And once you give up something to interpret and to explain something which your citizens see every day in the TV shows, you lost the narrative, and with losing the political narrative, soon you will lose political power. Thank you.